I don't know how to begin or how to kind of connect with all you people, but maybe the one clear idea, because as the lady said, this is all about seduction and a culture of desires. I need to give you some sense of what I think, 10 years ago, I gave a lecture, I think it was to the Television Society in London, who asked me to sum up the culture at that time. What was it? How did it work? I think if I could recall now, it was best summed up with 2 words. One of those words is authenticity, and the other is karaoke. Now, they can both sit well together, but you've got to be rather a magician to make that happen, or an old-fashioned alchemist of some kind. And most artists today spend their lives trying to authenticate the karaoke culture. Make it true. We live, for all intents and purposes, as far as I can tell, in a karaoke world. That's a world where high and low culture have completely merged. And karaoke culture can be best described as a kind of as good, clean fun for the millennial nuclear family. It's a kind of soundtrack for life itself. And it's a spectacle we've all become a part of. Karaoke in Japanese means dead orchestra. And in a sense, it's, we all know, mouthing the words of other people's and taking no genuine, real responsibility from the moment that performance ends. It's a life by proxy, and it's liberated by hindsight and unencumbered and free from any messy sort of process of creativity. It's impossible, in fact, to fail in a karaoke world. And the other aspect of the culture is that everything and everyone in it is for sale. Now, on the other hand, there's an undeniable thirst, and we have all touched upon it and all maybe have felt it during the last 10 years, for what we call the authentic. And partly the reason for that is because the authentic actually worships failure. It actually considers it a noble pursuit. And it believes in chaos and the entire messy process of creativity. One in which you have to roll up your sleeves and jump in the mud and mess about. And usually, when you find or see something that is authentic, and today that's a bit like looking for a ruby in a field of tin, it's usually not for sale. And that's a very interesting polemic that I won't debate now, but I want to tell you that I think that karaoke culture has become a way now, I'm now thinking 10 years from when I first gave that lecture, it's become a way of understanding and clarifying what is valuable, what is valuable in the culture today. No one today can even begin to question what or who the authentic is. Why? Because of the fear of failure. Why? Because of the fear of the messy process of creativity. Why? Because of the fear of actually being unfashionable. Culture has become today a kind of marketing phenomenon. And if you can be imitated in the culture today, you're worth a lot more than if you can't. Because art is fast becoming entertainment, and therefore part of a star-driven world. If you think of an artist like Damien Hirst, he is the product rather than the work he produces. When I grew up, I was born a very long time ago. I'm a really ancient creature, just shortly after the war, part of what people call baby boomers. I was brought up in what could be best termed a culture of necessity. What does that mean? That means that I was brought up in a world where you simply consumed only what you needed to survive. By the time I reached my teens and puberty, the culture had changed to what can be best described as a culture of desires, which in effect means you consume basically everything you didn't need to survive. By the end of the 60s was an era for me in which I dwelled in art school. Art school in England back in those days was filled with professors who were still living under the 19th century notion that art was for art's sake. The very word career was an anathema, just completely delete it from your brain. And frankly, they said it was much better to be a magnificent failure than any kind of benign success. And I think that probably rode very well on the same horse as the poets of the 19th century, such as William Blake, who, in those days, was our kind of mentor. It was, obviously, a very romantic period. By the dawn of the 70s, that romance somewhat ended when I was finally thrown out of art school and had to find an ordinary job if I could. I was actually totally unemployable. Basically educated to be unemployable. So my legacy is I had to figure out how I could become a magnificent failure. That was my objective in life. How could I look at this life, this place that I felt was really a hellhole? How could I become a failure? Well, I was born into a family of fashion people. My grandparents were tailors and corsetiers, and my parents were cheap copyists of Paris fashions. I was surrounded by fashion and I hated it. But when I was very young, I had an epiphany. It was one day as I was going to school, I saw these rather huge, tall, spotty English boys dressed with an air of menace. They had sported these very long coats that went just below their kneecaps, and very tight trousers and really greasy hair swept back, and they were better known as teddy boys. And there was something brooding in their whole way of body language, and they wore blue suede shoes, and they were part of a rock and roll fraternity, part of an outlaw spirit, part of something that became known as the rock and roll culture. And I suddenly realized that the look of people was very powerful. There was a kind of an identity, and you could read exactly who they were. They were, for me, very, very seductive, and I never forgot that image. So I decided I would make myself a similar suit after I left art school, and with the help of my girlfriend at that time, Vivian Westwood, I made myself a blue lame suit. I copied it off a cover of an Elvis Presley record and went to walk the walk of the trendiest street in London, hoping I could be exploited, taken off into an adventure, be fucked from one end of the street to the other. I don't know what, but something, please God, and get me away from this horrible normal life. Anyway, it was a cold November day, and I walked these streets, and I got to the end, the world's end, and I couldn't believe it. Nobody had even bothered to look at me. Here I thought I was a traffic light, and everybody seemed to be blind. Anyway, it was one of those typical November days. The clouds were ominous above, thunder struck, and it looked like I was going to end up looking like a blue lame rat, wet, dirty rat, unless I escaped in the ubiquitous red telephone box, which was all you had to communicate with life itself, the English not being very talkative. And I immediately wanted to phone my girlfriend and say, shit, nothing's happened to me. And fate sometimes plays you a card, and across my path pounced a man dressed in black like some Mephistophelian character, spoke with an American accent. I looked up at him. I was very short and he was very tall, and he said, what are you doing around here? I said, and I didn't know what to say. I just said, man, I got stuff to sell. And then I suddenly felt really stupid. And he pointed across the road like Moses, and over there, he said, and some black hole in the wall. And I went in through this black hole in the wall, and it was some little shop all dressed in black, and it had a jukebox at the end blaring out old 50s music like the ruins of a past culture, things I genuinely embraced, something I believed was genuinely authentic. And he said, you can put your stuff behind that jukebox and add on 25%, and that's mine. Anyway, I did everything he said. I ran home. I couldn't wait to tell friends. And suddenly I had found a place where I thought I could create an environment I could run wild in. I could stop myself from ever returning to normal life. And that was the beginning of my life outside of art school. And in fact, I really wanted to try and turn, as I attempted to do so over the years, this particular place into a number of different iconic stores that would connect what I felt was the look of music. That seemed to me the obvious thing. Music and fashion had played hand in hand with providing identities, various identities, for a number of generations. And this was a great canvas to work with. But, you know, being perverse, and I think most artists are somewhat perverse and rather dysfunctional, and I certainly am one of, it became too successful. And so I constantly closed it down. Really thinking back to the adage of that old art school lecturer that you had to learn how to be a magnificent failure and some kind of pathetic, benign success. So each time I was doubling up until I got to the point where the third incarnation of this store, which I'd redressed now and reframed and repainted and renamed and resourced and reworked and put more different stuff in it, I called sex. And it was interesting because that's something the English really have a problem with, sex, you know. And I thought, wow, this is it. This is a way, if I can only make clothes that looked wrong, I would work my way over to the other side of being, hopefully, a magnificent failure. And by being a magnificent failure, I would hopefully do what I think was deep down behind what that lecturer said, which was to try and change the culture in some way, was to not fear to cross that threshold and to be ultimately both sexy, subversive, and rather stylish, I thought. And that idea of making clothes look wrong, turning them inside out, upside down, wearing 3 sleeves instead of 2, cutting arms off of raincoats, making the most impractical clothes, and ultimately symbolically represented by the biggest icon of all, which was a pair of trousers that looked at first glance like you could never walk in them. Perfect. This was the ultimate impractical pair of clothes, and ones that genuinely looked wrong. But inevitably they became a rip-roaring success, but a success based on terms of looking like something that would fail, looking like something that wouldn't work. And that was one of the most seductive things I realized I could possibly do, and as it connected to a generation that felt like they were failures, that were feeling they couldn't access the culture, and they were desperately looking for a form of expression, just as I talked to you earlier about these teddy boys, looking for a form of expression and an identity that represented that. And these clothes did, and that the media finally labeled something that you all know very well today as punk. Now punk, 25, 30 years on, is still the defining measurement of what is cool. Every corporation on this planet uses punk today as a way of defining what's cool, because without you knowing what's cool, you can't possibly sell anything to anyone in the new generation. So in that sense, I suspect I have been inadvertently responsible for a genuine and sincere change in the culture. And for a moment, back in those days at least, it changed life itself for some, and in particular myself. To discuss all what's happened now of recent times is much more difficult, because we live in, as I say, this karaoke culture, and it's very, very difficult to figure out where product ends and ideas begin, where ideas don't become products, but remain in the ether and become, for instance, a lot more enigmatic and ultimately a lot more seductive. I think if punk had merely been a product, and by looking at least on the surface as if it's not for sale, it has survived much of the pragmatic world, the less than romantic world. It has survived many battles and continues to thrive as a defining way of basically making something cool. I think we live today also in a world that is completely audio-visual, and therefore the old coders of walking the streets and purchasing music has genuinely and sincerely ended. We certainly contributed, I think, to a DIY culture back in the 70s, and it dwelled in the 80s, and finally with gaming culture and the invention of the internet, it's finally moved into a massive world of interaction, daisy chaining, and anti-corporate thinking in that regard, where kids can merely make music and distribute it across the internet outside of a genuine old-fashioned industry. It's bypassed, because of that, much of censorship. It's been able to steal its culture back from those who stole it first. It's basically enabled a genuine anarchic feeling that has, in a sense, reduced the value of culture in a way that initially it first had. You know, the price is no longer the selling point. Meanwhile, contemporary art continues to rise and rise and rise. There are reasons for that. Partly a genuine belief in the future, partly dictated by market forces, where art will continue to play more and more a prominent part in the culture. It doesn't matter whether you're making paper or paper clips. Contemporary art is often the way, as most people in the fashion industry have seen, is a way to sell things today, because it's the last, very, very last part of any creative industry that still remains artist-led, whereas most other creative industries are basically corporate-led. Art still, the gallerist still basically beckons at the door of the artist. The artist still rules and still has proprietary control over how he expresses or she expresses herself. And that, in a sense, there is an unquestionable and undying trust. And it's a little bit of a gold rush. I'm sure you're all familiar with that. So where that leaves us is that art becomes the one place where most musical ideas, most film ideas, most performance ideas, most simple traditional European style drawing and painting all nestle together under this label, contemporary art. Art has become fashion, art has become entertainment, art almost has become shopping, almost. In other words, you as a shopper can pick and mix, put things together in ways you so desire, and it can end up a form of art. Because art can be anything you want it to be, provided it has 2 points, which is one, a certain intellectual curiosity, and two, it emotionally connects. And that's where we're at right this moment. You know, in England, first lesson is how to lie. That's what you're taught in England. I mean, you have to understand the English have survived as long as they have because they practice what's known as a culture of deception. The more successful they are, the more they can survive. But you know, I was brought up with this idea that you had to learn how to lie, and art school was the one place that broke that thread for me. So it was a very pure and really almost haven back in the days of the 60s. Not quite the same today, but back then it was an old-fashioned romantic haven. As I say, we would preach the laws and philosophy of people such as William Blake, which doesn't happen today. I mean, legends are just things media label you as, you know, you're a legend only because you caused a fuss at some point. You caused a blood vessel to burst in the established culture, and somehow or another, you managed to make people like that. Once you made people like that, you became a seductive personality, and in turn, you then became legendary. That didn't mean to say you are liked by the establishment. You could be a notorious legend. But a legend just means that you survived all of that, and they have to label you something. That's really it. Well, most people, you know, there are very few. I mean, I've lived on this planet a while now, and there are very few, if any, you know, maybe one or two I can recall, cultural moments where things really change. You know, doesn't happen very often, okay? But we all die for that moment, and that moment becomes a moment you cannot, you know, like some old boring fart, you cannot stop talking about that moment at some point. You know, if you go to some soiree or some party, or you know, inevitably the question will come up about something or other, you know, I was 12 years of age when my mum took me to your shop, Sex, and I bought my first pair of bondage trousers. And I'm thinking, wow, 12 years, you know, those trousers must have come up to your neck. You know, and I was thinking, do I believe him or do I not? Well, you know, maybe he uses that. Maybe he put his head in through the window or through the door. Maybe he did buy them and waited Or maybe he had a great tailor to be able to shorten them. I don't know. But I get these questions all the time, and you know, and these people are like Wall Street bankers. That's what you have to understand. People in power today, most people I know, we're all ex-punk rockers. That's the irony of it all. Yeah, just in attitude and so on. Because, you know, the clothes and the music and the fashion were a means to try to conceive a look and a sound. But inevitably, it was what you did with that. I think if someone were to ask me, in essence, how did you go from studying fine art in an art school for nearly 7 years? I was one of the longest. I used to keep changing my name so I could steal money from the government. So I would go from one art school to another and keep doing the same course. I just got found out one day when the same lecturer that was teaching me back in another school in the other part of London in the deep suburbs recognized me and realized I was the same guy, but I had a different name. And then I was thrown out. But ultimately, in art school at that time, you really you really did feel that you had to make a mark. It was part of your life. You know, if you didn't, you really felt terrible. You failed. So you did go out with this mission, and they were very strict about the fact that you should not ever think of career. That was. I was probably the last generation who were taught in that way. Yeah, I remember a guy, and he would say, when I first went to school, art school, and then we were all sitting there as new blood, he would say, if it weren't for old Bill Morris, none of you would bloody be here. And you think, who the hell is Bill Morris? And it was this guy, William Morris, some old 19th century socialist, and he took out a drawer and he held up this piece of chintz cloth. He said, that's Bill Morris. And you thought, oh, right, you know. So then you go on excursions to the William Morris Museum and you'd realize he's part of the arts and crafts movement. And this guy apparently was the guy that rapped on the door of Queen Victoria incessantly until he managed to tell her and made her agree that every working man who worked in the mine or woman who worked in a pea canning factory or whatever should have the right on the weekend to make something beautiful. Well, people don't need to belong to anything anymore. You know, that's why you have this sort of, you know, we live in a culture of artifice now more than ever. That's what I was saying, a kind of karaoke culture. And what art can do, and it's attempting to do it, but it's not happening yet, and it may not happen. It's the same kind of thing, you know, as I say, if I was to describe what I did in the 70s, it was turning art into action. Today you have two categories of art. One which is part of the genuine market in contemporary art, what you might call traditional. The other is what they labeled urban art. That means all the graffiti artists that have traveled since the 70s, 80s, and now in names like Banksy and so on and so forth, have become part of the contemporary art scene. And their prices are enormous. And people basically break down walls at night, seizing upon that piece of graffiti and get them into auction rooms to fetch money. This is going on. This is a kind of what I call the commercialization of vandalism. That is happening to a great extent. Why? Because people like that, you know. If I was an ad agency and I was trying to sell a PT Cruiser or something, you know, I think, and you want to kind of make it feel hip or cool in some way, you'd have to kind of think of something like, it's like if you break it, they'll buy it. It's like a kind of, you know, you got to destroy things in order to give it a value. A different kind of value, an integrity, if you like. You know, cover it with bullet holes. It'll look a lot better than without. So art has there is a guerrilla movement within the contemporary art scene, is what I'm trying to say. It is part of a kind of vandalism culture. It is becoming something that the advertising agency world is trying to get, because it's incredibly seductive. If you see someone destroying a car with bullet holes onto your TV screen as a commercial for the latest Ford or whatever, it's going to look a lot more interesting than if you see some guy with a pipe driving it through the countryside. It just is. Because if you can make something look cool by destroying it, then why not? You know, hey, corporations will go to immeasurable lengths to look, at least on the surface, as anti-corporate. Because by being anti-corporate, it's more cool than being corporate.